Some towns carry their sins like a man carries a scar, quietly, beneath the shirt, hidden from strangers. But the scar is always there. It aches when it rains. It burns in the dead of summer heat. And some nights, when the wind moves through the empty streets just right, even the buildings seem to remember. Dustwood was that kind of town. It sat at the bottom of a wide valley, pinched between two ridges of dark pine, like God had pressed his thumb there and left a mark. By 1883, Dustwood had grown into something real. Not a mining camp, not a way station, but a proper town with Main Street of wood plank sidewalks, a general store, a bank, 2 saloons, a church with a cracked bell, a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, and 400 souls who thought they were building something that would last. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Not in the spring of that year. Not before the night of May the 14th. Not before everything changed, and a man named Sheriff Elias Cobb came to understand the true weight of a badge. Elias Cobb was not a complicated man, or so everyone thought. He was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a gray mustache that drooped at the corners and eyes the color of river clay, brown, steady, unreadable. He had been sheriff of Dustwood for 11 years. He'd come to the position after a younger man named Hector Briggs wore the badge and died wearing it, shot in a card game argument that nobody should have died in. After Briggs, the town council looked around at the men of Dustwood and settled on Elias Cobb, a former Army sergeant who had survived the war in 2 cattle drives and who had never once started a fight, but had never once walked away from one either. He was not loved exactly, but he was trusted. In a town like Dustwood, that was better than love. His office sat at the north end of Main Street, a squat building of pine boards that had grayed with the years and swelled with moisture until the front door never quite closed all the way. There was a desk, a gun rack, a wood stove, a single cell in the back room with a rusted iron door, a window that looked out onto the alley between the sheriff's office and the Fairweather Saloon, through which Elias could hear, on most nights, the sounds of music and laughter and the occasional argument. He liked the sound. It meant the town was alive. He lived alone. He had been married once, a woman named Clara who came from Missouri and who had liked Dustwood just enough to stay and then, after 8 years, had liked somewhere else more. She had not been cruel about it. Neither had he. They had simply become 2 people with nothing left to say to each other. And she had taken the train east one April morning, and he had stood on the platform and watched the train go, and then walked back to his office and made coffee, and that had been that. He didn't blame her. He didn't blame himself. He filed it away somewhere deep and moved on. That was Elias Cobb's particular talent. Moving on. He was a man who believed in the present, in what was happening right now, right in front of him, in the business of today. The night of May the 14th, 1883, the business of today would ruin him. It began as a Tuesday night like any other in Dustwood. The sun went down behind the western ridge at 7:15, pulling the orange light off the rooftops and leaving the street in that deep blue shadow that always came before full dark. Lanterns came on in the windows, the general store, the hotel, the 2 saloons. Somewhere, a piano began playing something cheerful and slightly out of tune. Elias sat at his desk with a cold cup of coffee and a week-old newspaper from Denver. He read about cattle prices and a flood in Kansas, and a court case in Denver where a man had shot his own brother over a fence line. He shook his head at the fence line. He'd seen men die over less. At 8 o'clock, his deputy, a young man named Reuben Tate, came in for making his evening rounds of saloons. Reuben was 24, sandy-haired, eager in the way of someone who still believed that doing your job well meant the world would reward you. Elias liked him. Tried not to get too attached to him, the way you don't get too attached to anything in this life. Quiet out there, Reuben said, hanging his hat. Couple of ranch hands from the Harlows spread, drinking at the Silver Bell. Old Manny Voss sleeping on the church steps again. Leave Manny be, Elias said. I always do. Elias nodded, folded his newspaper, stood and stretched his back, which had been giving him trouble since February. Go home, Reuben. You sure? I can stay if... Go home. Reuben went home. Elias walked a window and looked out at Main Street. The plank sidewalks were empty. The lantern swayed slightly in the warm May breeze. The The piano in the Fairweather saloon was playing something slower now, something that sounded almost like a hymn. Elias stood there a minute, watching nothing in particular, and then went to the back room and lay down on the cot. He kept there for nights when he didn't feel like walking to his house. He was asleep by 9. He was awake again at 12 minutes past 11, and the world was different. The sound that woke him was not a gunshot. It was not a scream. It was something worse, in a way. It was the sound of people running, many feet, all at once on the wooden planks outside, and then voices, urgent, overlapping, and then someone pounding on his door. He was on his feet before the second knock. He opened the door to find Cy Beaumont, who ran the hotel, standing on his doorstep with his shirt untucked and his face the color of old paper. Cy Beaumont was not a man who rattled easily. He had survived 2 wives and a fire that took his first building, and a legal dispute with a railroad that had lasted for years. To see Cy Beaumont rattle was like seeing the ridge tremble. "Elias," Cy said. "The bank." That was all he said, but it was enough. The First Merchant Bank of Dustwood sat at the south end of Main Street, directly across from the church, as if the 2 buildings were watching each other. It was a solid building of brick, the only brick building on Main Street, with a heavy front door of iron-banded oak and 2 windows, both barred. It had always seemed to Elias like the most permanent thing in Dustwood, the thing that said this town means business. This town will last. The front door was open, not broken open. Open, the lock had been worked, not forced. Elias stood in the doorway with his lantern held high and took in the room. The teller counter on the left, undisturbed. The clerk's desks, undisturbed. The painting of President Arthur on the wall, undisturbed. And in the center of the floor, the vault door, standing open. And on the floor in front of the vault, face down and still, a man. Elias moved forward slowly, the way you move towards something you are not sure you want to reach. He crouched beside the body and turned it gently, and a lantern light fell across the face of Harlan Fitch, the bank manager. Harlan Fitch was 60 years old, a slight, precise man with thin white hair and small hands that were always clean. He had managed the First Merchant Bank for 9 years. He had 3 daughters in town and a wife named Dorothy, who sang in the church choir. He was not the kind of man you expected to find dead on a bank floor, but there he was. There was blood on the floor beneath him, but not much. He had been struck on the back of the head, a single blow, deliberate and efficient. His keys were still in his hand. His hand was still warm. Not long dead. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe less. Elias stood, looked at the vault. Empty, not stripped bare in a panic. Empty in a way that meant someone had known exactly what was there and taken exactly what they wanted. The town's operating fund, the Merchants Association deposit, the payroll for the railroad survey crew who were working the ridge above town, the private savings of perhaps a dozen families. $60,000. Gone. And Harlan Fitch, gone from the world. Elias stood in that vault and breathed the stale air and let the full weight of the thing settle onto him. Then he walked back out into the street, where a crowd had gathered, 30, 40 people in night clothes and boots, holding lanterns, asking each other questions nobody could answer. He looked at their faces, frightened, expectant, waiting for him. "Everybody go home," he said, loudly and without anger. "You can't help standing here. Go home and stay there. I'll have word to you in the morning." Nobody wanted to go, but something in his voice, that old army voice, that voice that had moved men into places they didn't want to go, made them go. He rode out of town at midnight to look for tracks. The ground around the bank's back door had been swept clean, not by wind, but by a broom or a piece of burlap. Whoever had done this had planned it, had thought about the morning after. That told him something. He found no tracks. He found no horses. He found, in the alley behind the bank, a single brass button, small, plain, military style, that could belong to half the men in Dustwood or none of them. He put it in his pocket and rode back to town. In the days that followed, Elias Cobb did everything a good lawman is supposed to do. He telegraphed the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. He questioned every man who had been in the saloons that night. He questioned the bank's 3 employees, 2 young tellers named Abbott and Priest, and a night clerk, A quiet man named Samuel Cross who had the strange habit of never quite meeting your eyes. He spoke to Dorothy Fitch, who sat very straight in her best chair, and answered his questions with a kind of terrible composure that made him feel worse than tears would have. He learned that Harlan Fitch had gone to the bank at 10:30 that night, which was unusual. His wife said he'd received a note. She hadn't seen the note. She didn't know who sent it. There was no note at the bank. If it had ever existed, it was gone. He learned that the bank's rear door, the one that opened to the alley, had its own lock, separate from the front. Only 2 keys existed for that lock. One had been on Harlan Fitch's keyring. Elias found it there, still attached, when he went back to look. The other key was kept in the bank safe, now empty. Whoever had the other key had taken it from the vault, or had made a copy. He wrote up his findings. He sent letters. He waited for the marshal. The marshal came 10 days later, a thin, sunburned man named Garrett who smelled of tobacco and looked at the scene with the flat eyes of someone who had seen too many crimes and solved too few. He asked some of the same questions Elias had asked. He added nothing new. After 3 days, he shook Elias's hand and rode back to Santa Fe. "Keep at it," Garrett said, which was the most useless advice Elias had ever received. The weeks turned into months. Summer came to Dustwood, and the heat pressed down on the town like a thumb on a bruise. People did not stop talking about the robbery. They never stopped. In the saloons, at the general store, on the church steps after Sunday service. Always the same question, turning over and over like a stone in a river. Who? That word, who, became the air of the town. It got into everything. It changed the way people looked at each other. Suspicion is a slow poison, but it works. By August, neighbors who had traded and drunk and prayed together for years were looking at each other sidelong, adding up little things. A man who paid a debt he'd been carrying for years, a woman who bought a new dress when she shouldn't have been able to afford it, a family that moved away suddenly and didn't say goodbye properly. Elias interviewed them all. Every lead dissolved like morning fog. The hardest part was the families. 6 families in Dustwood had lost everything in that vault. Their savings, their security, the future they'd been building dollar by saved dollar. The Kellermans, the Pruitt family, old widow Teague. Each one came to him in different ways, angry, broken, quiet, and each time Elias sat across from them and told the truth, because he'd never had it in him to lie to people who needed the truth even when it hurt. "I don't have an answer yet," he said, again and again. "I haven't stopped looking." He hadn't. He woke at 5 every morning and worked until dark, going back over every piece of information, every interview, every detail. He kept a board in his office, a plank of pine he'd nailed to the wall, with names and dates and notes and a rough map of the town. He stood in front of it for hours sometimes, trying to see the shape of the thing. And it was in front of that board, one hot evening in late July, that Elias Cobb noticed something. He noticed that the way you sometimes notice a thing you've been looking at for so long it stopped registering. He noticed it because he was tired, because his eyes had gone soft, and because he'd stopped trying to see the pattern and was just looking at the names. There was a name that should have been on his board that wasn't. He sat down slowly. He thought for a long time. The name was Thomas Aldridge. Thomas Aldridge was not a man who attracted notice, which was, Elias now realized, itself a kind of notice. He was 43 years old, a prosperous man. He ran the dry goods supply business that served most of the ranches in the valley. He was on the town council. He was a deacon in the church. He had served with Elias on the committee to repair the schoolhouse roof 2 summers ago. He had a wife named Eleanor and a son away at school in Missouri. He had not come to Elias in the weeks after the robbery. Every other prominent man in town had. To offer help, to express concern, to ask how the investigation was going. Thomas Aldridge had not. Elias thought about that. He also thought about the military-style button he'd found in the alley. He thought about the fact that Thomas Aldridge had served in the Army before coming to Dustwood, something Aldridge never talked about, and that Elias only knew because it had come up once, almost accidentally, in a conversation years ago. He thought about the fact that the Aldridge supply business had been struggling. Quietly, in a way that only a man who watched the town's money carefully would notice. A few debts not paid on time. A contract with the Harlow Ranch that had not been renewed. A new supply company from the county seat undercutting his prices. He thought about the fact that Thomas Aldrich had, 2 months after the robbery, quietly paid off the mortgage on his building. And then Elias Cobb did something that cost him everything. He waited. He didn't confront Aldrich. He didn't search his premises. He told himself he was building a case, that a prominent man, a deacon, a councilman, needed to be approached carefully, needed evidence beyond what he had, needed a proper case that would hold up. He told himself he was being thorough. But at night, alone, he knew the truth. He was afraid, not of Aldrich, not of confrontation. He was afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of accusing a man of his standing on the basis of a button and a mortgage payment, and the feeling in the bottom of his gut. He'd been wrong before about smaller things, and the memory of those mistakes lived in him like splinters. So he waited. He gathered more notes. He wrote more letters. He watched Aldrich from a careful distance, and Aldrich gave him nothing, was calm, normal, nodded him in the street, sat in his church pew every Sunday. And while Elias waited, Thomas Aldrich sold his business. The sale was announced in October. Aldrich said he was retiring, that he and Eleanor were moving to be closer to their son in Missouri. It was announced in the Dustwood Courier as a pleasant piece of news. People wished him well. There was a small farewell gathering at the Fairweather Saloon, which Elias attended, standing at the edge of the room, watching. Aldrich shook his hand on the way out. His grip was firm. His eyes were clear. "You'll catch whoever did it," Aldrich said quietly, with what sounded like genuine warmth. "I've always believed in you, Elias." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Thomas," he said. The Aldriches left Dustwood on the 15th of October, 1883. Their wagon rolled up the main street at 8 in the morning, and a few people came out to wave. Elias stood in the doorway of his office and watched them go. He stood there for a long time after the wagon had turned out of sight. He went inside. He sat at his desk. He put his face in his hands. He had waited too long. He had no jurisdiction in Missouri. He had no real evidence, only feelings and circumstance. The marshal, if he sent another letter, would want more than that. And Thomas Aldrich was gone into the wide American nothing, and the $60,000 was gone with him, and Harlan Fitch was still dead in the cemetery on the hill above town. Elias Cobb sat at his desk for a very long time, and then he did something he had never done before in 11 years as sheriff. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, took out a bottle of whiskey he kept there for guests, and he drank from it. Not a sip, not a sociable pour. He drank from it the way a man drinks when he is trying to get somewhere far away very quickly. He didn't get there. He just got drunk and sick, and then slept badly on his cot, and in the morning the problem was still exactly the same size as it had been. The case went cold. There is no other way to say it. By the end of 1883, Elias Cobb had no active leads, no suspect in reach, no evidence that would satisfy a court. The marshal's office had moved on to other cases. The town of Dustwood had settled into the slow, grinding process of carrying an unsolved wound. Dorothy Fitch moved away to live with her eldest daughter in Colorado. The Kellermans lost their farm, unable to recover their savings in time to make it through the winter. Old Widow Teague never quite recovered, not financially, not in spirit, and died 2 years later in a way that the doctor called natural causes, and that Elias privately believed was something closer to giving up. He stayed. Where else would he go? The badge was all he had left. He wore it like a sentence. In the years that followed, something slow and terrible happened to Elias Cobb. He did not drink himself to ruin. He pulled back from the bottle after that first terrible night, because he understood what it was doing, and he was enough of a soldier to refuse to break completely. He went on working. He settled disputes. He kept the peace. He rode out to the ranches when he was needed. He handled the town's ordinary business with his ordinary competence. But the town knew. A town always knows. They watched him, and they saw a man who had not solved the crime that mattered most. And over time, slowly, the way erosion works, not all at once, their trust shifted. It didn't become hatred. Dustwood was not a cruel town, but the warmth went out of it, the ease. People were polite to him, the way you are polite to a doctor who couldn't save a patient. Respectful, careful, never quite comfortable. And Reuben Tate, his deputy, who had been so eager and so full of belief, Reuben left in 1885. He took a position with the sheriff's office in the county seat, which had more money and a cleaner record. He told Elias he was leaving for the opportunity, which was true. He did not say that he was also leaving because he couldn't watch his mentor carry a failure that was getting heavier every year. He was kind enough not to say that. Elias was grateful. In the spring of 1887, for years after the robbery, Elias received a letter. It came from a lawyer's office in Kansas City, Missouri. It was brief, dry, and professional, and it destroyed him. The letter informed Sheriff Elias Cobb of Dustwood, as a matter of professional courtesy, that a man named Thomas Aldridge had died 3 weeks earlier of a heart attack in his home in Kansas City. His estate was being settled by his wife, Eleanor, and his son, James. The letter included one more piece of information, which the lawyer passed along, because he had been instructed to do so by Aldridge himself, in a sealed document to be opened upon his death. Elias read this last part 3 times, standing at his desk with the letter shaking slightly in his hands. Thomas Aldridge had confessed. In the sealed document, in his own handwriting, Aldridge had admitted to the robbery of the First Merchant Bank of Dustwood on the night of May 14th, 1883. He had described how he'd done it. The copied key, made 6 months earlier by a locksmith in the county seat, the note that lured Harlan Fitch to the bank that night, the blow that was meant to stun but that had struck too hard in the dark and the fear and the panic of a man who had convinced himself he could do a thing he could not. He wrote that he had not meant to kill Harlan Fitch. He wrote it 4 times, as if repetition could make it mean something. He wrote that he had watched Elias Cobb investigate. He wrote that he had known, from the evening of the farewell gathering in October, that Elias had suspected him. He wrote that Elias had looked at him in a way that no innocent man looks at another, and that he had spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, certain the sheriff would be at his door in the morning. And then he wrote the thing that broke Elias Cobb completely open. He wrote that he had been in Dustwood for 3 more days after that farewell gathering, 3 days during which he had packed his belongings and arranged to sell his building, and that during those 3 days he had waited every morning with a heart in his throat for Elias Cobb to come for him. He never came. Aldridge wrote that he had not understood at the time why the sheriff had hesitated. But sitting in his comfortable Kansas City house, with his comfortable Kansas City life, with years of distance and an old man's clarity, he thought he finally knew. He was a good man, Aldridge wrote. That was his problem. He was too good to act on instinct alone. He needed more than he had. He needed to be sure. And I walked away because he couldn't be sure, and that is the heaviest thing I carry. Not what I did to the bank. Not even what I did to Harlan Fitch. God help me. But what I did to Elias Cobb. I made a good man doubt himself. And in this world, that is perhaps the cruelest thing one man can do to another. Elias read the letter. He folded it very carefully. He put it in the drawer. He sat at his desk for the rest of the afternoon, without moving. That evening, as the sun went down behind the western ridge and the lanterns came on in the windows of Dustwood, Elias Cobb unpinned his badge from his shirt. He set it on the desk in the center of a square of laslight that came through the window and sat there like a small star. He looked at it for a long time. He had solved the case. Too late, in the wrong order. The answer had come to him instead of the other way around, delivered by a dead man's guilt across 4 states and 4 years. $60,000. Never recovered. Dorothy Fitch, widowed. The Kellermans, broken. Old widow Teague, gone. And Harlan Fitch, who had walked to the bank at 10:30 on a spring night, because someone he trusted had asked him to, a member of the church council, a neighbor, a man who shook his hand every Sunday. Harlan Fitch, who had died on a bank floor with his keys in his hand. Elias thought about all of them. He thought about Reuben Tate, somewhere in the county seat, probably doing fine. He thought about Clara, probably doing fine somewhere east. He thought about Thomas Aldridge, dead in Kansas City, probably in a decent house on a decent street, his comfortable life outlasting his guilty conscience by just enough time to write the letter. He thought about himself, the man he had been, the man he had become, the space between the two. He stood. He walked to the window. The street was alive in the evening way it had always been. The piano in the Fairweather, the lanterns swaying, the sound of voices. 400 souls going about the business of their lives. The town was still here, still alive, still building something. The thing about towns, Elias thought, is that they go on. They go on without you. The failure of one man doesn't stop a town from living. Maybe that was something. He put on his coat. He walked out the door, leaving it open behind him. It never closed properly anyway. He walked down the plank sidewalk, and the boards made their familiar sound beneath his boots. And he nodded at two men coming out of the general store, and they nodded back, and he kept walking. He walked to the cemetery on the hill above town. He stood at Harlan Fitch's grave for a long time without speaking, because he was not a man who talked to the dead, and he was not going to start now. But he stood there in the dark on the hill, with the lights of Dustwood spread below him like scattered embers, and he let the full weight of the thing press down on him without flinching from it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. 2 words, quiet as a confession in a church. "I'm sorry I waited." The wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge. The lights of Dustwood burned below. Somewhere in the town, a dog barked once and then went quiet. Elias Cobb stood there in the dark for a good long while, and then he walked back down the hill into the lights, into the life of the town that had been his responsibility, and his failure, and his home, and the night closed around him, and the story of what had happened became the kind of story that towns keep forever, not written down, not spoken straight, but carried, in the way people glance at the bank when they walk past it, in the way old-timers go quiet when someone asks about the robbery, in the particular sound of a piano playing something slow, and almost like a hymn on a warm spring night. Some crimes are solved, and some crimes solve themselves, too late, leaving nothing behind but the shape of a man who could have done more and didn't, and a long, quiet shadow that shape throws across everything that comes after. The badge sat on the desk in the empty sheriff's office all that night, catching the light from the lantern he'd left burning. Nobody found it until morning, and by then Elias Cobb was gone. Where he went, no one in Dustwood ever knew for certain. Some said north into the high country. Some said he took the train to nowhere in particular. Some said he became something else, a different name, a different town, a different life, carrying the same guilt. But in Dustwood, for years and years after, whenever a stranger rode into town and asked who the sheriff was, there was always a pause, a particular pause, the kind that holds something in it, and then the answer, given quietly, with a weight that strangers couldn't quite understand. "We've had a few since Cobb," someone would say, and then, almost always, they would look away. The piano would play. The wind would move through the street. And Dustwood would carry its scar into another day.